The sky above Riyadh was still dark when the first warning came. Not a knock on a door, not a phone call from a neighbor, not an alert on a television screen. A sound, sharp, deep and rolling across the city like distant thunder, except there were no clouds that night, no rain, no desert storm building on the horizon. Just that sound, raw and enormous, tearing through the air above one of the Arab world's most populated capitals. And the 5 million people who heard it, from their beds, from their kitchens, from the windows of high-rise apartments and modest family homes and hospital rooms and hotel corridors, every single one of them felt it in their chest before they understood what it was. Something was being destroyed above their city, something deadly, something that, if it had fallen instead of exploding in the sky, would have changed everything about that night and every night that followed. This is the story of February 28th, 2026, the night that Iran fired ballistic missiles directly at the capital of Saudi Arabia, the night that Riyadh became a target, and the night that Saudi Arabia showed the entire world what it truly means to be ready, completely, methodically, terrifyingly ready, for exactly this kind of attack. But to understand how this night arrived, you have to go back a few hours earlier, because this did not come from nowhere. Nothing this explosive ever does. In the early hours of February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a joint military operation against Iran. Not a warning shot, not a limited symbolic strike designed to send a message and wait for a response. A full, massive, simultaneous, coordinated assault hitting multiple locations inside Iran at the same time, codenamed Operation Epic Fury. Fighter jets approached from multiple directions. Cruise missiles were fired from naval vessels positioned in the Arabian Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. Precision munitions struck specific buildings, specific rooms, specific coordinates that had been mapped and verified over months of intensive intelligence work. The entire plan had been built on thousands of hours of satellite tracking, human intelligence, signals intercepts, and the kind of detailed operational preparation that takes not weeks, but months to complete. The Israeli military would later describe how its intelligence officers had spent thousands of hours tracking the locations and movements of Iran's senior leadership, how the number of targets had been increased by hundreds of percent, how the decision was made to strike in daylight rather than darkness because the intelligence picture was better and the element of tactical surprise, as the military put it, had been achieved for what they called the second time, referencing previous strikes against Iran during the conflict of June 2025. And then came the detail that sent shockwaves across every government, every military command, and every intelligence service in the world. Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, the man who had controlled every major foreign policy decision, every nuclear program decision, every military escalation decision in the Islamic Republic since 1989, was killed in those strikes. Dozens of Iran's most senior military commanders went with him, senior members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, top officials from Iran's intelligence apparatus. The entire upper tier of the Iranian state's command structure was, in the space of a single morning, shattered. The news traveled at the speed of a satellite signal. Every capital in the Middle East knew within minutes. And in Tehran, the men who were still alive, the remaining generals, the surviving IRGC commanders, the officials who had not been at the wrong building at the wrong moment, did not pause to absorb the loss. They did not convene emergency meetings to debate proportionality. They loaded their missiles and they fired. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued a statement that left absolutely zero room for interpretation. Every American military asset in the Middle East, every base, every airfield, every harbor that had received a U.S. naval vessel, every radar installation, every logistics hub, was now a legitimate target. And every country that hosted those assets, regardless of what political position it had taken, regardless of what diplomatic assurances it had given, was now inside the strike zone. For Saudi Arabia, this declaration created a moment of acute and layered vulnerability. And this is where the story gets complicated in a way that most people outside the region do not fully appreciate. Saudi Arabia had not been passive or ambiguous in the weeks leading up to this crisis. Riyadh had made a specific, deliberate, formal communication to the Iranian government through official diplomatic channels. The message was direct. Saudi Arabia would not allow its airspace to be used to attack Iran. Saudi Arabia would not allow its territory to serve as a staging ground or a corridor for strikes against the Iranian state. Whatever was happening between Washington and Tehran, Riyadh was telling Tehran clearly and explicitly that it was not a participant in this conflict. That message, that pledge, that act of deliberate diplomatic restraint meant absolutely nothing when the IRGC missiles started flying. Iran struck Saudi Arabia in multiple locations, nearly simultaneously. The Riyadh region, the eastern province along the Gulf Coast, the Jazan area near the Yemeni border. Iran drew no distinction between Gulf states that had actively cooperated with U.S. military operations and those that had genuinely tried to stay neutral. It did not factor in Saudi Arabia's explicit assurances. In the white-hot fury of that retaliation, the only criterion that mattered to the IRGC planners was the presence of American military personnel and American military hardware. And American military presence in Saudi Arabia was not small. It was enormous. The most critical installation on that target list was Prince Sultan Air Base, located in the desert landscape of the Al-Kharj region, approximately 60 kilometers south of central Riyadh. This facility is not just a military base in the conventional sense, it is a nerve center. More than 2,300 American military personnel are stationed there permanently. It holds Patriot missile batteries, the advanced PAC-3 variant that uses direct kinetic collision to destroy incoming ballistic missiles. It holds THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, which engages missiles at a higher altitude and an earlier point in their flight path than Patriot can reach. The base serves as the primary coordination hub for U.S. air and missile defense operations across the entire Arabian Peninsula. In the weeks immediately before the attack, satellite imagery had captured something significant happening at Prince Sultan, a buildup of American aircraft at a scale consistent with pre-strike staging. 16 KC-135 aerial refueling tankers, the massive planes that allow fighters and bombers to extend their range by refueling in midair, were documented at the facility. 6 E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft were there too. The AWACS, recognizable by the enormous rotating radar disc mounted above the fuselage, can simultaneously track hundreds of aircraft and hundreds of missiles across hundreds of kilometers of sky. They are the eyes that see everything. They are the information feed that allows defense systems to respond faster than human reaction time alone would ever allow. These planes were positioned at Prince Sultan because U.S. military planners knew, with high confidence, that if strikes on Iran were launched, Iran would strike back. The question was not whether. The question was where and when, and the answer to where included Saudi Arabia. The second major target was King Khalid International Airport in northern Riyadh, one of the busiest airports in the Arab world, a civilian hub that handles tens of millions of passengers every year, connecting Saudi Arabia to Europe, to Asia, to Africa, to the wider world. If Iran wanted images of destruction, wanted footage of burning infrastructure, wanted international headlines showing the consequences of U.S.-Israeli action in terms of destruction to an allied nation, hitting a major civilian airport and getting those images out globally would have served that purpose with brutal efficiency. Iran knew exactly what it was shooting at. What Iran appears to have misjudged, or perhaps chose to gamble against despite knowing the odds, was the depth, the quality, and the battle-tested experience of what Saudi Arabia had waiting in the sky to meet those missiles. The history of Saudi Arabia's air defense capability is a story that stretches back more than 30 years, and every chapter of that history matters for understanding how February 28th ended the way it did. When Operation Desert Storm began in January 1991, Saudi Arabia had recently become the first country in the Middle East to receive the American Patriot missile defense system. On January 17th of that year, an Iraqi Scud ballistic missile was intercepted by a U.S. Patriot battery deployed on Saudi territory. It was the first time in human history that an anti-ballistic missile had ever been fired in actual live combat. That single event marked the beginning of a relationship between Saudi Arabia and missile defense technology that would deepen and expand over the following 3 decades into something genuinely formidable. But the education that truly matters is not the one that happens in training centers. It is the one that happens under fire. As the war in Yemen ground on across years and years of grinding conflict, and as Houthi forces equipped with Iranian-designed and Iranian-supplied ballistic missiles began firing those weapons at Saudi cities, with increasing frequency and increasing accuracy, the Royal Saudi Air Defense Forces gained something that no simulation program, no exercise, no classroom can replicate. They gained real combat experience. They learned to read radar signatures under live fire conditions. They learned to time intercepts against missiles traveling at hypersonic speeds in the terminal descent phase. They learned through hard and repeated experience which intercept geometries were most reliable, which situations demanded a second interceptor to guarantee destruction of the incoming missile, and how to manage multiple simultaneous threats without their systems becoming overwhelmed. They failed, sometimes. Missiles got through. Saudi towns and Saudi citizens paid the price of those failures. But Saudi Arabia analyzed every one of those failures with the same systematic discipline that it applied to its successes. Each outcome, hit or miss, was fed back into doctrine, into training, into technical upgrades. The Royal Saudi Air Defense Forces became, over years of this real-world education, extraordinarily good at an extraordinarily difficult job. The Missile Defense Advocacy Alliance, an internationally respected organization that independently tracks the air and missile defense capabilities of nations globally, arrived at a conclusion about Saudi Arabia's record that surprises most people outside the defense community. The Royal Saudi Air Defense Forces were the world leaders in actual ballistic missile intercepts. Not the United States military, not the Israeli Defense Forces, which also has extensive experience. Saudi Arabia. The country had intercepted more real ballistic missiles in real combat conditions than any other nation on the planet. The statistic is almost never mentioned outside of specialized defense publications. It should be far more widely known. The hardware backing that experience had also been systematically upgraded. By 2014, Saudi Arabia completed a $7 billion contract with Raytheon to upgrade a significant portion of its Patriot systems from the PAC-2 configuration to the newer and substantially more capable PAC-3 standard. The difference between these two systems is fundamental. The PAC-2 destroys an incoming missile by detonating a proximity-fused fragmentation warhead near the target. Effective, but probabilistic. The PAC-3 uses a hit-to-kill approach. It does not rely on blast radius. It physically collides with the incoming missile at extreme velocity, using the kinetic energy of the collision to shatter the target completely. Against ballistic missiles traveling at the speeds they reach during terminal descent, this direct collision approach is dramatically more reliable than fragmentation. The physics are unforgiving. You are trying to hit a bullet with another bullet, but the engineering that makes it possible is genuine. The THAAD system adds a different layer at a different altitude. Where Patriot engages in the terminal phase of a missile's flight, the final seconds of steep descent toward the target, THAAD engages earlier, at higher altitudes, while the missile is still in its descent phase but before it has reached maximum terminal velocity. This higher altitude engagement offers meaningful advantages. The defense has more geometric options for achieving a clean intercept. The debris from a destroyed missile, when destroyed at high altitude, falls across a wider and less densely populated area. And a threat destroyed early is a threat that never reaches the terminal phase, where even the best Patriot battery is under maximum pressure. The combination of THAAD operating at high altitude and Patriot PAC-3 operating in the terminal phase creates what military planners describe as a layered defense architecture. Each layer is independently capable of defeating incoming threats. Together, they create a defense in depth that dramatically raises the probability of stopping a multi-missile attack. If a missile somehow defeats the first layer, the second layer engages. The attacker must defeat both systems in sequence to get anything through. Against an arsenal that relies on quantity to overwhelm a point defense, this layered approach is the most effective counter available with current technology. Since 2022, Saudi Arabia had also been part of a US-led initiative called the Middle East Air Defense Alliance, integrating Saudi radar and tracking data with allied systems across the region, including Israel. This integration meant that when an Iranian missile launched, the detection was not dependent on Saudi sensors alone. The entire network of allied radars and surveillance platforms contributed to the picture. Warning time, though measured in minutes, was maximized. The targeting data was richer than any single nation's sensors could provide. And the E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft circling above Saudi Arabia on the night of February 28th, part of the buildup that satellites had photographed in the days before, were feeding real-time tracking data into defense systems that were already primed and ready. Inside Saudi Arabia's air defense command centers, the alerts came and the battle stations were manned within seconds. The tracking systems computed trajectories, velocities, projected impact points, optimal intercept windows, and the operators of the Royal Saudi Air Defense Forces, people who had done this before, in real combat with real consequences, executed exactly what they had trained and fought and prepared for across years of defending their country. They fired their interceptors. Across Riyadh, civilians heard the sound of those intercepts from street level. The distinctive acoustic signature of a Patriot or THAAD interceptor destroying a ballistic missile at altitude does not sound like anything else in the world. People who were outside or near windows described something between a massive sonic crack and a concussive impact that resonated through the chest, not the rolling boom of a ground explosion. Something sharper, higher, more metallic. The sound of violent kinetic energy being released in the atmosphere above the city, high above the apartment buildings and the shopping malls and the mosques and the highway overpasses of Riyadh. Saudi Arabia's missile defense systems were doing their job. An eyewitness standing near King Khalid International Airport reported it with a simple sentence that carries enormous weight. They said they saw and heard the air defense intercept the missile in the sky. Think carefully about what those words mean. This was not a classified after-action assessment. This was not a military press release reviewed for accuracy days later. This was a person standing near a major civilian airport, looking up, watching Saudi Arabia's defense architecture destroy an Iranian ballistic missile in real time, with their own eyes, above one of the Arab world's busiest air travel hubs. A Gulf intelligence source briefing AFP confirmed the full picture shortly after the engagement. Air defenses had successfully intercepted Iranian missiles near Riyadh's international airport and near Prince Sultan Air Base. Airport operations were not disrupted. There were no reported human losses from the attack on Riyadh. Prince Sultan Air Base, with its 2,300 American personnel, its AWACS aircraft, its refueling tankers, and its irreplaceable missile defense hardware, had been directly targeted and remained fully operational. Let that outcome settle for a moment. Iran fired ballistic missiles at a capital city of 5 million people. It targeted a major civilian airport and a major U.S. military installation simultaneously, and the casualty count from the attack on Riyadh was zero. Zero. In the unforgiving mathematics of ballistic missile warfare, that is not the normal outcome. That is the result of a defense system performing at the highest level of excellence. It is the product of decades of investment, years of real combat experience, billions of dollars in hardware, and the disciplined professionalism of operators who understand from experience what is at stake when the alarm sounds. But Riyadh was not the only city under attack that night. Because while Saudi Arabia was defending its capital, Iran was simultaneously hitting targets across the Gulf in a coordinated wave of strikes that made February 28th the most dangerous night in the region since the Gulf War of 1991. In the UAE, Iranian missiles struck toward Al Dhafra Air Base in Abu Dhabi, one of the most significant U.S. Air Force installations in the Middle East, hosting reconnaissance aircraft and serving as a key hub for regional U.S. air operations. Residents across multiple neighborhoods in Abu Dhabi reported hearing enormous explosions in the sky above them. UAE air defense systems engaged and intercepted the majority of the incoming missiles, but one person was killed, a civilian. The UAE government issued an immediate condemnation, describing the attack as a flagrant violation of its sovereignty, and reserved the right to respond. In Qatar, Iranian missiles were aimed directly at Al Udeid Air Base, the largest U.S. military installation in the Middle East, home to approximately 10,000 American troops and serving as the forward headquarters of U.S. Central Command. Al Udeid is, in a very real and non-metaphorical sense, the command brain of American military operations across the entire region. Qatar's Patriot air defense systems intercepted the incoming missiles targeting Al Udeid. No material damage was confirmed, but Al Jazeera's correspondent reporting live from Doha described hearing more than a dozen separate explosions above the city during the engagement, each one the sound of a Patriot interceptor doing its job in the Qatari sky above the Gulf. Bahrain was struck. Kuwait activated its air defenses and engaged hostile targets in its airspace. Sirens sounded in Manama. Residents of multiple Gulf capitals were sheltering from missiles on the same night. This was not a targeted surgical campaign against one adversary in one location. This was a message delivered simultaneously to every government in the region, fired in missile form, stating that hosting American forces made you a participant in this conflict whether you wanted to be or not, and the consequences rippled outward in ways that extended far beyond any single missile impact. Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the UAE all immediately closed their airspace. The Gulf Aviation Corridor, one of the world's most trafficked, with the hubs in Dubai and Doha processing hundreds of thousands of passengers daily, went dark. Flights were diverted mid-route. Passengers were stranded. Airlines scrambled their schedules across multiple continents. The economic disruption began accumulating the moment the airspace closures were announced. But the most alarming single development of the entire crisis was the information that began emerging from the waters below. Maritime shipping companies operating in the Gulf received notices about the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow stretch of water between Iran and Oman, at its tightest point barely 40 kilometers wide, is the single corridor through which approximately 20% of all oil traded globally passes every single day. Saudi oil, UAE oil, Iraqi oil, Kuwaiti oil. Every barrel pumped from the fields of the Arabian Peninsula destined for refineries in Asia or Europe or anywhere beyond passes through this choke point. When those closure warnings went out, the reaction was not regional. It was global. Oil markets moved. Freight rates spiked. Energy analysts on every continent began modeling what even a brief disruption to Hormuz would mean for fuel prices, for inflation, for industrial supply chains that depend on petroleum-derived products at every stage of production. The Strait of Hormuz is not a military chess piece. It is the economic artery of the modern world's energy supply. Any serious disruption there is a global emergency, not a regional one. Back in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia moved with speed and precision to define its public position. The Foreign Ministry statement released on February 28th was precise in every word it chose. Saudi Arabia expressed its strongest condemnation of what it described as blatant and cowardly Iranian attacks. It recalled publicly that Saudi Arabia had given Iran advance assurances that its territory would not be used against it, and stated this explicitly so the record was permanently clear. Saudi Arabia had kept its word. Iran had attacked anyway. And then came the sentence that every analyst and every regional government read with careful attention. The kingdom affirms that it will take all necessary measures to defend its security and protect its territory, citizens, and residents, including with the option of responding to the aggression. That phrase, including with the option of responding, is not accidental language. It is deliberate. It says that Saudi Arabia is not committing to respond and is not ruling out responding. It is holding a door open. It is saying, do not mistake our current restraint for permanent patience. Do not mistake our success in defense for a willingness to absorb unlimited aggression. The option exists, and it has not been removed from the table. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman made a series of calls immediately following the attacks to the leaders of the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan. Every one of those countries had also been targeted that night. Each was navigating the same fundamental question. What does a world in which Iran fires missiles at your capital mean for your future security calculations? The calls were about building a shared position, a coordinated narrative of condemnation, and the foundations of whatever collective response might eventually follow. The conflict itself showed no sign of slowing. The United States remained in active military operations. Iran declared 40 days of mourning and vowed to fight on. The IRGC stated its operations would continue until the enemy was defeated. Iran's foreign minister said Tehran would resist as long as it takes. A country that had just absorbed the assassination of its supreme leader and the destruction of its top military leadership was still firing. There is a cost calculation inside missile defense that rarely gets discussed in public, but that shapes every decision about these systems. Each PAS-3 Patriot interceptor costs Saudi Arabia between $3 and $4 million per missile. Saudi defense doctrine calls for firing 2 interceptors at each incoming target to guarantee the kill. Stopping one incoming missile therefore costs $6 to $8 million. Iran's ballistic missiles, the Fateh 110 series, the Zulfiqar family, cost the attacker perhaps a few $100,000 each to manufacture. The defender pays millions. The attacker spends thousands. Over years of intercepting Houthi missiles, this asymmetry had already consumed enough Saudi interceptor stocks that the United States approved a $3.05 billion sale to replenish them. That was before February 28th added to the total. But the answer to that economic calculation is not economic. It is existential. The cost of not defending is measured in lives, in a destroyed airport, in a military base lost, in a capital city on fire, in images broadcast globally that signal weakness and invite further aggression. Against those costs, $6 or $8 million per successful intercept is not expensive. It is what survival looks like when someone has decided to send a ballistic missile toward your city. The operators of the Royal Saudi Air Defense Forces, who were at their stations on February 28th, tracking inbound threats on radar screens, computing intercept solutions in seconds, pressing launch controls at the precise calculated moment, were not thinking about cost ratios. They were thinking about the city behind them. 5 million people. And they delivered. Riyadh is standing. The airport is open. The base is operational. The 5 million people of the Saudi capital woke up on the morning of March 1st, 2026, in a city that had been targeted by Iranian ballistic missiles less than 24 hours before and found that city intact. They looked up at a sky that still carried the faint vapor trails of the previous night's intercepts, white lines dissolving slowly in the morning air. And they understood, whether they knew a single technical detail about Patriot systems or not, that something exceptional had protected them while they slept. The conflict is not finished. Iran is still armed. The United States and Israel remain in active operations. The Gulf states are navigating a regional war that none of them sought, but all of them are now part of. The Strait of Hormuz question remains open. The option of Saudi response remains on the table, unresolved. And Iran still has close to 2,000 ballistic missiles. In the brutal arithmetic of this new reality, the defense only has to fail once for everything to change. Saudi Arabia knows this. Every operator who stood watch on February 28th knows this. The radar screens have not been turned off. The Patriot batteries are still loaded. The THAAD systems are still locked. Because in a world where ballistic missiles are being fired at capital cities, being ready is not a policy choice. It is the only choice there is. Riyadh survived the night. But in the Middle East of February 2026, surviving one night only means you have to be ready for the next one. And the next one is already coming. There is something about this story that gets lost in the speed of breaking news cycles and the avalanche of military briefings and diplomatic statements and analyst commentary that pours out during a crisis of this magnitude. Something quiet, something human. Think about what it means to be a civilian in Riyadh on the night of February 28th, 2026. You are not a soldier. You are not a missile defense operator. You are not a general watching a radar screen. You are a parent, a student, a shopkeeper, a nurse finishing a late shift. You are going about the ordinary business of a late winter evening in a Gulf city when a sound unlike any thunder you have ever heard rolls across the sky above your building. Your children look up. Your phone lights up with emergency alerts. Your neighbors are in the street looking at the sky. And above you, high above the city lights and the minarets and the highway overpasses, something is happening that you cannot fully see but can absolutely hear and feel. You do not know in that moment how many missiles are coming. You do not know if the defense systems will catch all of them. You do not know if the next explosion you hear will be another intercept or something reaching the ground. You are standing in a city of 5 million people, and somewhere above you a battle is being fought at altitudes and speeds that human beings were not designed to comprehend in real time. That is the experience that statistics and military assessments do not capture. The raw human reality of living in a city under a ballistic missile attack, and the fact that the people of Riyadh went through that experience and came out the other side without a single life lost to the attack itself. That fact matters not just as a military metric, but as something profoundly human. Families stayed together. The streets that were empty during the alerts filled again afterward. The city kept breathing. There's also something important to understand about the context in which Saudi Arabia built the capability that saved those lives. It was not built in response to a theoretical threat. It was built in response to hundreds of real attacks. Over the course of the Yemen conflict, Saudi Arabia had been targeted by ballistic missiles more than any other country in the world in that same period. Every single one of those attacks was a live training exercise for the Royal Saudi Air Defense Forces, a real-world laboratory of threat and response, failure and adaptation, improvement and refinement. When defense experts say that Saudi Arabia's air defense forces have more combat intercept experience than any other military on Earth, they are describing something that was paid for in years of tension, in nights of alarm sirens, in the psychological weight that accumulates when your country is repeatedly targeted and your job is to stand between the missile and the people behind you. That is an experience that no Allied military, not the Americans, not the Israelis, not any European Air Force, has accumulated to the same degree in the modern era. And on February 28th, all of that accumulated experience, all of that refined doctrine, all of those system upgrades and training hours and hard-won tactical adjustments were called upon simultaneously, in the space of minutes, against a threat that was real, that was moving, and that was aimed at killing people in one of the Arab world's most important cities. They stopped it. This is also a story about what alliances are actually for. Not in the abstract, not in the language of diplomatic communiques, but in the concrete physical reality of radar data flowing between Allied systems in real time. The American AWACS aircraft above Saudi Arabia that night were not there by accident. They were there because the United States and Saudi Arabia had spent decades building the infrastructure of a partnership that functions not just in meetings and arms deals, but in the actual integrated architecture of mutual defense. The tracking data those aircraft provided, fed into Saudi Air Defense Command systems, made the intercept calculations faster and more accurate. The THAAD systems at Prince Sultan Air Base were there because a U.S.-Saudi relationship had been maintained, funded, and operated jointly across administrations and across decades. That relationship has its critics. The Saudi-American partnership is not simple, and it is not uncomplicated. The politics around arms sales, around Yemen, around regional policy, none of that disappears because of what happened on February 28th. But what February 28th demonstrated is that when ballistic missiles are coming toward a city, the quality and depth of the alliance infrastructure determines whether those missiles reach the ground or die in the sky. And on that night, the infrastructure held. The story of Riyadh under fire is ultimately 3 stories at once. It is the story of a military achievement, a defense system performing at the highest level of its capability under real combat conditions, stopping a ballistic missile attack on a major civilian and military target with no loss of life from the attack itself. It is the story of a geopolitical moment, a Middle East transformed in the space of a single day, where a supreme leader was killed, a regional war expanded, a strait was threatened, airspace across multiple nations was closed, and the question of what happens next remains genuinely and terrifyingly open. And it is the story of 5 million people who heard the sound of their own defense in the sky above them on a February night and woke up the next morning in a city that was still standing. Riyadh is still standing. For now, and with every radar screen still on and every battery still loaded, that has to be enough.